Hey everybody, I'm Christina from Big Beautiful Sky. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about Uranus through Gemini, and we're going to look back through history and discuss what this transit could create specifically for the United States, because we're approaching the third Uranus return in 2027, and the themes do point towards conflict and war and a new monetary system. Uranus is an outer planet known for its association with unexpected changes, revolutions, innovation, sudden disruptions, and it orbits the sun for approximately 84 years. It spends about 7 or 8 years in each zodiac sign. And when Uranus transits Gemini, it brings about revolutionary, unexpected, and transformative changes to Gemini themes, Mercury ruled themes like education, media, communication, communities, and currency. Uranus disrupts the status quo to bring about progress. Its influence is associated with individuality, freedom, originality, and it incites radical shifts in societal norms. The best definition that I've found about Uranus is from Richard Tarnas. He says, quote, "The unanimous consensus among astrologers is that the planet Uranus is empirically associated with the principle of change, rebellion, freedom, liberation, reform, and revolution, and the unexpected breakup of structures, with sudden surprises, revelations, and awakenings, lightning-like flashes of insight, the acceleration of thoughts and events, with births and new beginnings of all kinds, and with intellectual brilliance, cultural innovation, technological invention, experiment, creativity, and originality. In addition to the occurrence of sudden breakthroughs and liberating events, Uranus transits are linked to unpredictable and disruptive changes. Hence, the planet is often referred to as the cosmic trickster." So, in Gemini, the third sign of the zodiac, ruled by Mercury, the planet of communication, intellect, learning, and information, we're going to see a lot of things change rapidly. There's going to be a lot of curiosity. Please be adaptable, which I think is going to be really refreshing. A strong desire for intellectual stimulation. We're going to want to learn. We're going to want to explore. We're going to want to communicate. We're going to want to share ideas. And everything is going to be happening lightning fast. So it's going to be a really disruptive time. Not all good, not all bad. But the thing that's really interesting is that when Uranus was in Gemini throughout history, especially in the United States, this cycle correlates to massive uprisings, wars, and territorial changes. The map of the United States always changes, and so does the currency. Remember that last year, Uranus was in Gemini from July 7th, 2025 till November 7th, 2025. And we did see a change in the currency with the passage of the Genius Act, which really hasn't come into play yet because Uranus has gone retrograde back to Taurus. But Uranus is re-entering Gemini again from April 25th, 2026 to August 3rd, 2032. And then again, December 12th, 2032 to May 22nd, 2033. Which will be very, very interesting. I'm also going to talk about the fourth turning because that correlates to this Uranus cycle. A lot of you may have heard about the fourth turning, the stage that we're in of this 80-ish year cycle, and what it means for the United States. According to the Sibley chart, the U.S. will have its third Uranus return on July 26, 2027. So we are leading up to that big dramatic moment, and things will probably get very interesting. But let's talk about the American Revolutionary War first. It took place from 1775 to 1783. During the American Revolution, the American colonies were seeking independence from British rule, and Uranus was transiting through Gemini. The first shot of the Revolutionary War was fired in Lexington, Massachusetts at sunrise on April 19th, 1775. And that put Uranus at 0 degrees Gemini and Pluto at 26 degrees Capricorn. The Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776 at 5:10 p.m. with Uranus at 8 degrees Gemini. This is the Sibley chart and what most astrologers use as the United States natal chart. The Declaration of Independence is considered the founding document of the United States, and it's really quite profound, especially when you put it in the context of that time period. It was written as a formal explanation of why the Continental Congress voted to declare American independence from Great Britain. And it was drafted a year after the American Revolutionary War began. The Declaration of Independence is important because even though what it was saying really wasn't applicable to the United States at the time, women had no rights, slaves had no rights, the intent, the power of the document seeded this country that became a representation of freedom. And that is a very Uranian theme. If you haven't read the book Power versus Force, I really encourage you to do so. It's a fantastic book. And he calibrated the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, and the Constitution. I'll read to you what he wrote from Power versus Force. He said, "The power of the United States or any other democracy arises from the principles upon which it is founded. Thus, we can find the basis of power by examining such documents as the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence, and such acknowledged expressions of the spirit of democracy as the Gettysburg Address. If we calibrate the relative power of each line of these documents, we find the highest attractor pattern of all, out of which the power of the entire United States government emanates in the Declaration of Independence. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So this statement calibrates at 700, which is the highest level, which is enlightenment. He also said the sentiments echoed in the Gettysburg Address, where Abraham Lincoln reminds us this nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. This, too, was spoken during Uranus's transit through Gemini. This calibrates at 700, which is also enlightenment. So he said the makers of the Declaration of Independence were astute in drawing a very clear distinction between that which is spiritual and that which is religious. They must have intuitively, if not rationally, known the marked difference between the power of the two. Religion is often associated with force, sometimes so, historically and today, whereas spiritual concepts such as loyalty, freedom, and peace do not create strife or conflict, much less war. Spirituality is always associated with nonviolence. He was very clear to point that out in reference to the Bill of Rights, where we have, of course, freedom of religion. And what he is saying is the Declaration of Independence is a very spiritual document. The Gettysburg Address is very spiritual. And so what we'll find as we unpack these themes of Uranus and Gemini is, even though everything is conflicted and it feels hard and it feels heavy, what's happening is a breakthrough. And hopefully, once we get to the other side of it, it creates more freedom. All right, so let's talk about the American Civil War. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and Uranus was also in Gemini. It was the first Uranus return in the United States, and like the Revolutionary War, pitted Americans against Americans. If you watch the Ken Burns documentary that was just released about the American Revolution, he also has one about the Civil War. They're brilliant. But both of these wars were also civil wars. In the American Civil War, the northern states fought the southern states over slavery, resulting in a transformative shift in American society, aligning with Uranus's symbolic association with radical change and freedom. The first shot of the Civil War was fired at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861 in Charleston, South Carolina. Uranus was at 9 degrees Gemini conjunct Mars. A few days later, Neptune at 29 degrees Pisces entered Aries. This was the U.S.'s first Uranus return, and it kicked off a war. We have very similar astrology right now. So everything that's happening in the country is a reflection of that. As Neptune ingresses into Aries, we will probably see similar themes from the Civil War bubble up, and just be mindful of that. The Civil War ended at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9, 1865 with Uranus at 26 degrees Gemini. Now we're going to travel forward in time to World War II, the third time Uranus was in Gemini in the history of the United States. So this was also the second Uranus return in Gemini. World War II was a global conflict with remarkable technological advancements, particularly in communication, transportation, and military weaponry. The United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor at 7:48 a.m. on December 7th, 1941. Retrograde Uranus at 27 degrees of Taurus, just like it was on January 3rd, 2026, when the U.S. invaded Venezuela, was what kicked off the United States entering World War II. So Uranus was in Gemini, it retrograded back to Taurus, and then went back into Gemini. And that's currently what we have going on. I made another video about this because when the Venezuela invasion happened, there was a similar setup in the astrology. If you look at the Sibley chart on January 3rd, 2026, and the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941, very similar themes, except Pluto right now is in Aquarius, opposite where it was in Leo during World War II. So it's like this inversion of World War II. Instead of the US acting like the heroes, we are acting not heroically. So check that video out. Uranus did not enter Gemini until May 1942. The Battle of Midway occurred a few weeks later in June 1942. So the second Uranus return occurred on May 31st, 1944. And a few days later, on June 6, 1944, the D-Day operation brought together the Allied Army's land, air, and sea forces in what became known as the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The war ended on September 2nd, 1945 at 9 a.m., a few weeks after the U.S. dropped the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The surrender treaty was signed on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Uranus was at 17 degrees Gemini. So, as you can see, Uranus and Gemini, war. The third Uranus return in the United States at 8 degrees occurs on July 26, 2027, but I consider it in orb from 2026 to 2029. Now, I want to talk about something else, which is also setting up this pattern, and it's happening this year. So let's be mindful of it. It's Mars conjunct Uranus and Gemini. The Declaration of Independence was being drafted and adopted. Uranus was conjunct Mars and Gemini at 7 degrees on June 13th, 1776. So that was setting up that preamble. At the beginning of the Civil War, Mars was conjunct Uranus and Gemini on April 17th, 1861 at 9 degrees. During the Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini at 5 degrees on January 16th, 1944, Eisenhower began to plan D-Day. Now in 2026, we have Mars conjunct Uranus and Gemini on July 4th at 3 degrees, which is our 250th anniversary. I think this is concerning considering the historical implications of these conjunctions in Gemini. So if you look at the astrology of July and August 2026, it's big. Please be mindful of the energy and prepare, plan, and stay calm. There's also a correlation between Jupiter and Uranus conjunctions and war. It has to do with breakthroughs. It's creative. There's philosophical awakenings, the starts of new movements and revolutions. But I found a link between Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions and speeches that ignite the flames of war. For example, Patrick Henry delivered his famous Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death oration on March 23rd, 1775, a few months before the conjunction in Gemini at 3 degrees on June 8, 1770. And that really did fuel the Revolutionary War. Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous A House Divided Cannot Stand speech on June 16th, 1858, a few weeks after the conjunction in Taurus when Uranus hit 0 degrees Gemini. There was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus on May 8, 1941, when FDR, who served 4 terms as U.S. president, declared a state of unlimited national emergency in response to Nazi Germany's threats of world domination. He repeated his famous remark that he made in 1933 during the Great Depression, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Now, the U.S. entered World War II that December. There was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction at 21 degrees Taurus in April 2025. Joe Biden announced he would seek re-election, and during that speech remarked that, quote, "We are in a battle for the soul of America. The question we are facing is whether in the years ahead we have more freedom or less freedom, more rights or fewer. Freedom, personal freedom, is fundamental to who we are as Americans. There's nothing more important, nothing more sacred. Around the country, extremists are lining up to take those bedrock freedoms away. This is not a time to be complacent. That's why I'm running for president." So again, you can see that theme, that Uranian theme of freedom, 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 echoing through Biden did drop out of the race a few months later, but the speech was still profound, and I marked it when it happened. In that speech, he was actually very prescient in that he was saying, we will have a battle for freedom on our hands. And right now, we really do. Now, I want to talk about the Uranus-Pluto cycle. Again, Uranus is making a direct trine to Pluto in 2026. Another huge deal. The Uranus-Pluto cycle represents a revolutionary cultural change as well as technological innovation that completely transforms society. This cycle lasts 127 years on average. During this cycle, Uranus awakens this desire for freedom to liberate us from oppressive structures, especially those that are corrupt and no longer serve life. Pluto adds this intensity and this power, which drives reform at multiple levels of society. So this is really good news. That's why I think the second half of this year, we're going to see this epic flip. People are just going to freak out. We'll have Uranus trine Pluto on July 18th, 2026, and then again on November 29th, 2026. So July is shaping up to be a big month. According to Richard Tarnas and Cosmo and Psyche, Uranus-Pluto period, you see a lot of rebellions against the establishment and a desire for freedom, radical social and political change with an intensified will to create a new world, empowerment of revolutionary and rebellious impulses against oppression, the spread of radical political philosophies, intensified artistic and intellectual creativity, scientific breakthroughs, and experimentation that drive innovation and rapid technological advances. Because Uranus is in Gemini, this is going to be like hyper, hyper, hyper. Uranus trine Pluto occurs 5 times from July 26th to May 2028. So we're going to have this energy of just rebellion, revolution, freedom, and this transformative effect that's going to push us to rapidly evolve. And we're going to see, I think, so much technological innovation and advancement. It's going to be quite jarring. The other thing I want to talk about is Uranus and Gemini and how it relates to currency changes in the United States. On May 10th, 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the issuance of the first $2 denominations in bills of credit for the defense of American independence. Uranus was at 1 degree Gemini. So instead of using the British pound, the colonies started using their own currency. In April of 1861, Southern states began issuing their own money known as the Confederate States dollar. These notes were nicknamed graybacks because the Confederacy had no gold or silver backing for the currency. They were essentially promissory notes that became worthless as the South's military prospects declined and inflation soared. Uranus was at 8 degrees Gemini when these were issued. In order to finance the Civil War, Congress passed the Act of July 17th, 1861, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury issued non-interest-bearing demand notes, which became known as greenbacks because of their color. All U.S. currency issued since 1861 remains valid and redeemable at full face value. Uranus was at 14 degrees Gemini. Now, fast forward to World War II. The U.S. dollar officially became the world's primary reserve currency following the Bretton Woods Agreement on July 22nd, 1944. Delegates from 44 nations met to rebuild the international economic system, decided to peg their currencies to the U.S. dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This made the dollar the anchor of the global economy. Uranus was at 11 degrees Gemini. So I expect to see a change in U.S. currency, and I think it has something to do with the passage of the Genius Act, which happened last year. Uranus moved into Gemini on July 7th, 2025. On July 18th, 2025, Donald Trump signed the Genius Act, which opened the door for a new form of government-backed currency. Cryptocurrency, despite calling itself currency, really hasn't been considered an official currency until now-ish. It's like a yes, but pretty much, but not really still. Aquarius, which is ruled by Uranus, rules crypto. And with Uranus and Gemini, a Mercurial sign that rules currency, not as money itself, but as the mechanism of exchange via communication, movement, and negotiation. Mercury is energy that makes currency flow. So that's the link that I see between this Uranus and Gemini and the currency system changing. Mercury is the process and the systems like trade, contracts, markets, data that allow the currency to function in the economy. So what we're seeing with the passage of the Genius Act is the traditional definition of currency getting a shakedown. And with Bitcoin taking off while Uranus was in Taurus, which is a Venus ruled sign, money, it's how it's being exchanged, Gemini, Mercury, is being revolutionized. So Uranus was in Gemini at 0 degrees, trine Pluto in Aquarius, which was retrograde at 2 degrees. And we had the Genius Act passed, which pretty much legitimized cryptocurrency as currency. While the Genius Act doesn't create a new official cryptocurrency in the sense of declaring Bitcoin or Ethereum legal tender, it established an official government-regulated framework for US dollar-pegged payment stablecoins, effectively allowing them to function like digital versions of the US dollar. It's really confusing, but I'm sure this will evolve as we move forward with Uranus back into Gemini. So it doesn't officially declare crypto as legal tender, but it makes US dollar pegged stablecoins functionally equivalent to digital currency. So they're usable for daily commerce with official regulatory approval. Got it? Just watch this space because it's all connected. Now, I want to talk about the fourth turning. That's the mainstream way of people talking about this Uranus cycle. The fourth turning theory, it's also known as the Strauss-Howe generational theory. It's a sociological model that views history as a recurring cycle of generational seasons. It was developed by historians William Strauss and Neil Howe in 1997, and it states that American history moves in an 80-ish year cycle called saecula, which is the span of a long human life. If you can live 84 years, then you complete a Uranus cycle, which is exciting for you. So they identified this without understanding astrology, which is amazing. According to their book, The Fourth Turning, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny, they say a saeculum, I think I'm saying that right, is divided into 4 distinct stages called turnings. Each lasts roughly 20 to 25 years. So again, it's the perfect Uranus cycle in that every time Uranus squares or opposes, we have a new turning. And they label these turnings as like shifting moods, and they peg these archetypes to them. So to understand how this cycle works, I put it in context with World War II. So during World War II, we had a new Uranus cycle seeded. And so we see the first turning begin post World War II from about 1946. This era lasted from 1946 to 1964, this first turning. It was also the beginning of the new Uranus cycle, and it lasted from the Uranus return until the square. So from 1946 to 1964, we saw strong institution, weak individualism, and we saw a very confident and collective society, right? This was the golden age of American capitalism, and that we had the strongest and biggest middle class the world had ever seen. The country was very successful and profitable. During the second turning, which took place from 1964 to 1984, which was kicked off with the square, Uranus square Uranus, there was spiritual exploration and rebellion against the established order. So personal autonomy began to become the focus instead of that collectivism. Now, the third turning was from 1984 to 2008, and that was the opposition. Institutions started to weaken, and they became distrusted. Individualism was peaking, and society started to feel fragmented. The fourth turning, which is where we are now, and it feels like a crisis, started in 2008, and it's where we see institutions collapse. It starts with that square until we hit the next Uranus return and start the new cycle. What I've noticed, though, with this turning theory is that it fits the Uranus cycle, but not completely, in that I don't think we're going to see the fourth turning end until the 2030s when Uranus enters Cancer. Typically in US history, once Uranus hits Cancer, that's when things kind of calm down. Everyone starts to really regroup and rebuild. And that's when the freedom and the ideals that were seeded and sowed during Uranus and Gemini really start to be embodied. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see this fourth turning, this collapse end until the 2030s. So from 2026 to 2032, it might be a little bit of a bumpy ride, but you'll be okay. So I just want you to acknowledge that, yes, everything is falling apart. There's a new system that's being created. There will probably be war and conflict. There will be a new monetary system. This does not mean the end of your life. It just means the end of the cycle. My advice is to let go of the old ways of doing things and start building new right now. Because as things collapse, the best thing we can do is let go of all that old stuff and start building new ways to do things and make sure that the new ways are there and ready to go when that old system collapses. What I see playing out right now is the collapse of globalism. If we look back at the Uranus cycle that's ending, post World War II was the beginning of globalization, right? There's actually a lot of cycles ending and new ones beginning, right? The US sort of orchestrated globalism as a post World War II construct, in that we agreed to patrol the oceans and have military bases everywhere and keep the world and trade safe. Now we're seeing the US contract. And not only is the Uranus cycle fueling this, but so is the Pluto cycle. There's a really interesting book, which I haven't read yet, which I have bought, but I will read. Investor Ray Dalio points out in his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail, which was published in 2021. He talks about the big cycle. It's a 250-year cycle, which also perfectly corresponds with the Pluto cycle. So if you remember, the US just had its Pluto return. We're celebrating our 250th anniversary this year. So that cycle, that empire cycle, is also ending for us. And along with that comes the end of globalization. So at the end of this 250-year cycle, Dalio says, we're in that end of the cycle right now, and we will probably see a loss of our reserve currency and a total collapse. So this, combined with Uranus and Gemini, is pointing towards, yes, we will have a new monetary system. There's also another really great book I highly recommend. I read it in 2023. It's by economist Peter Zeihan. It's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning. Reading this book shocked me. And Peter has pretty much predicted exactly what's happening now, even though he didn't think Trump would be elected. And I do see Trump expediting this collapse and this end of globalization very quickly now. But in the book, Zeihan talks about the end of globalization and what that will mean for the world. And it didn't matter who was president, it was always going to happen. He says in the book, since 1945, the world has been the best it has ever been, the best it will ever be. The last 75 years will be remembered as a golden age, and one that didn't last nearly long enough at that. Globalization wasn't an American century, it was an American sacrifice, which is over. The American-led global system has led to remarkable peace and prosperity, and it is ending. The American-led order is giving way to disorder. So in the book, you'll have to read it, but he explains why the end of globalization won't be a great thing for a lot of countries in the world. So as people cheer for this collapse of the US, they might not like what lies on the other side. So read Ray Dalio's book. He tells you how to invest. Read Peter Zeihan's book. He tells you what to expect and possibly where to live. Read The Fourth Turning to understand this Uranus cycle and what happens once we get to 2033 and how that new cycle will look and feel. I do believe we're going to see a rebirth and renewal in the United States during the 2030s, but I think it's going to require a focus on domestic issues rather than managing the global order. So until then, stay healthy, stay calm, stay regulated. Know that this too shall pass. And like FDR said during the last fourth turning, there is nothing to fear but fear itself. So if you need help, if you need guidance, if you need to clear your trauma and your blocks, get in touch. I'm at bigbeautifulsky.com. Book a session. I can't wait to meet you. Best of luck. Bye.